The Quatermass Legacy, How a BBC Series Redefined Horror. Introduction, a transmission from the unknown. On a summer evening in July 1953, British television viewers gathered around their sets for what they thought would be ordinary entertainment. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented. A broadcast that would send tremors through living rooms across the nation and ultimately reshape the landscape of horror fiction for decades to come. As the eerie opening notes of the theme music faded, viewers were introduced to Professor Bernard Quatermass, a brilliant but troubled rocket scientist whose name would become synonymous with a particular brand of intellectual terror that Britain had never experienced before. But what exactly makes this series so enduring? How did a low-budget BBC production, created in an era when television was still finding its footing, manage to cast such a long shadow over horror and science fiction? And why, decades later, do filmmakers, writers, and horror aficionados still speak of Quatermass with hushed reverence? The answer may lie in a peculiar incident that occurred during the original broadcast, one that blurred the lines between fiction and reality in ways that even Nigel Kneale, the series' creator, could never have anticipated. But before we unravel that mystery, we must first journey back to post-war Britain, where the atomic age was dawning and new anxieties were taking root in the collective consciousness. Chapter 1. Genesis of a Nightmare. In the early 1950s, British television was still in its infancy. The BBC had resumed broadcasting after the war, but was searching for content that could captivate audiences and demonstrate the potential of the medium. Enter Nigel Kneale, a young writer from the Isle of Man with a knack for combining scientific concepts with primal fears. Kneale had already made a name for himself writing radio plays, but television offered new possibilities for horror. The immediacy of the visual medium, combined with the intimacy of viewing in one's home, created potential for a different kind of terror than cinema could provide. It was in this context that Kneale conceived of the Quatermass experiment, which would air as a 6-part serial beginning on July 18, 1953. The premise was deceptively simple. Professor Bernard Quatermass, head of the British Experimental Rocket Group, must deal with the aftermath when one of his rockets returns to Earth with 2 of its 3 astronauts missing, and the third, Victor Carroon, undergoing a mysterious transformation. What followed was a tense investigation revealing that Carroon was being overtaken by an alien organism that had absorbed his companions and threatened to consume all life on Earth. Rudolf Cartier, an Austrian émigré with experience in German expressionist cinema, directed the series with a visual flair unusual for television of the period. Despite severe technical limitations, the episodes were broadcast live with only a few pre-filmed sequences. Cartier and Kneale managed to create a sense of mounting dread that kept viewers returning week after week. What distinguished the Quatermass experiment from other science fiction of the era was its grounding in scientific plausibility. Kneale meticulously researched rocket technology and biology, lending the fantastic elements a disturbing credibility. Professor Quatermass himself, portrayed with stern authority by Reginald Tate, was not a wild-eyed mad scientist, but a serious, dedicated researcher whose investigations led him into territory where science offered little comfort. The show's success was immediate and overwhelming. An estimated audience of nearly 8 million viewers, enormous by the standards of the time, watched the final episode, in which the transformed Carroon, now a massive, tentacled creature, was confronted in Westminster Abbey. When Quatermass convinced the creature to commit suicide by appealing to what remained of Carroon's humanity, audiences were left shaken but captivated. The BBC, recognizing they had a phenomenon on their hands, quickly commissioned a sequel, but they, and perhaps even Kneale himself, couldn't yet fully grasp how this six-part serial would transform the genres of horror and science fiction, not just in Britain, but across the world. Chapter 2. The Quatermass Trilogy, Cosmic Horror for the Atomic Age. Following the success of The Quatermass Experiment, Nigel Kneale went on to create two more BBC serials featuring the determined professor, Quatermass II, 1955, and Quatermass in the Pit, 1958-59. Together, these three productions form what is now regarded as the original Quatermass Trilogy, a triptych of terror that escalated in ambition and philosophical depth with each installment. Quatermass II saw John Robinson take over the title role after Reginald Tate's untimely death. The story drew direct inspiration from the Cold War paranoia permeating society, presenting an invasion scenario where alien entities take control of high-ranking government and industrial figures to establish massive food processing plants, actually incubators for their own kind. The parallels to both communist infiltration fears and the rapid industrialization changing the British landscape were unmistakable. What made Quatermass II particularly unsettling was its suggestion that the institutions meant to protect the public could be subverted from within. When Quatermass discovers an isolated community built around a mysterious government facility, the series offered viewers a disturbing vision of authoritarianism in the name of progress. The serial culminated in scenes of mass panic as the alien presence is revealed, creating some of the most memorable images in early television horror. But it was with Quatermass in the Pit, 1958-59, known in the U.S. as 5 Million Years to Earth, in its film adaptation, that Kneale truly transcended the limitations of the genre. André Morel, delivering what many consider the definitive portrayal of Quatermass, investigated an apparent archaeological find in the London Underground that conceals a Martian spacecraft millions of years old. The story's central conceit, that human evolution and development were influenced by ancient Martian visitors, and that our capacity for violence is their legacy, was revolutionary for its time. The serial's exploration of racial memory, psychic phenomena, and the origins of human violence pushed far beyond conventional science fiction boundaries. Its most terrifying sequences involved mass psychic events, as the unearthed spacecraft activates latent alien influences in the human population, causing widespread violence and destruction. The image of a giant ethereal horned figure manifesting over London in the final episode is one of the most striking visuals in television horror history. Throughout these three serials, Kneale developed what would become his signature approach, using science fiction frameworks to explore deeply rooted social and existential anxieties. Unlike much of American science fiction of the period, which often offered reassuring narratives of heroic scientists defeating alien threats, Quatermass presented a world where science could identify horrors but rarely conquer them completely. The trilogy's lasting power comes from its refusal to offer easy comfort. Each serial ends not with triumph but with qualified survival. Humanity continues, but fundamentally changed by its encounter with the unknown. This philosophical pessimism, combined with striking visual imagery and methodical pacing, created a template for thinking person's horror that would influence generations of creators. Chapter 3. From Television to Cinema, the Hammer Films Adaptations. The impact of Quatermass soon extended beyond the small screen. Hammer Film Productions, a studio that would later become synonymous with Gothic horror, recognized the commercial potential in Kneale's creation and adapted The Quatermass Experiment into a feature film titled The Quatermass Experiment, 1955, in the UK and The Creeping Unknown in the US. Directed by Val Guest and starring American actor Brian Donlevy as Quatermass, the film marked a crucial turning point in Hammer's history. Previously known for making noir thrillers and comedies, Hammer was seeking new directions, and the success of the Quatermass experiment provided it. The film's X certificate, hence the spelling in the UK title, was deliberately sought to emphasize its adult horror elements, establishing a marketing strategy that Hammer would employ for years to come. Donlevy's portrayal of Quatermass was notably different from the television versions, more brusque and less intellectual, a change that Kneale himself disliked. Nevertheless, the film succeeded in capturing much of the serial's tension while adding more explicit horror elements that television couldn't show. The transformation of astronaut Victor Carroon, Richard Wordsworth, into an alien entity was rendered with disturbing practical effects that pushed the boundaries of 1950s cinema. The film's success led Hammer to adapt Quatermass 2 in 1957, again with Donlevy in the lead role. This adaptation followed the television serial's plot relatively closely, though compressed to fit a feature-length running time. The movie's depiction of an isolated factory complex controlled by aliens struck a chord with audiences familiar with the rapid industrialization and government secrecy of the Cold War era. However, it was the third film adaptation, Quatermass in the Pit, 1967, that is generally considered the finest of the series. By this time, Hammer was well established as a horror studio, and the film benefited from a larger budget and advances in special effects. Andrew Keir stepped into the role of Quatermass, delivering a performance closer to Kneale's original conception of the character, intelligent, determined, and morally complex. Directed by Roy Ward Baker, the film brilliantly translated the television serial's ambitious themes to the big screen. The excavation of an ancient Martian spacecraft in London's Hobbs End Underground Station, a fictional location that has since entered horror folklore, was realized with impressive production design. The film's climactic sequences, in which the psychic influence of the Martian vessel awakens humanity's latent violent tendencies, remain disturbingly effective. What the Hammer adaptations accomplished was to bring Quatermass to a wider, international audience and cement the character's importance in horror history. While American science fiction films of the 1950s often featured invading aliens being defeated by military might, the Quatermass films presented more ambiguous conclusions where science and reason barely prevailed against cosmic threats. The Hammer connection also placed Quatermass within the broader context of British horror cinema, creating a bridge between the psychological science fiction of the BBC serials and the more visceral horror films that would define the studio's output in the 1960s and 1970s. Without Quatermass, Hammer might never have become the powerhouse of horror that gave us iconic versions of Dracula and Frankenstein. Chapter 4. The Social Commentary Within the Terror. What elevated the Quatermass serials above typical science fiction fare was Nigel Kneale's acute awareness of the social and political anxieties of post-war Britain. Each installment can be read as an extended metaphor for the concerns troubling the British public during a period of immense transition. The Quatermass experiment aired just 8 years after the end of World War II, when Britain was still rebuilding and adjusting to its diminished place in the global order. The story of a British space program reaching for the stars, only to encounter disaster, mirrored the nation's struggle to define its identity in the post-imperial era. The creature that Victor Carroon becomes, absorbing and incorporating everything it touches, can be seen as representing fears about loss of individuality and identity in an increasingly homogenized modern world. Quatermass 2 more explicitly addressed political concerns, particularly the growth of secretive government facilities during the Cold War. The mysterious factories processing alien food sources paralleled the rapid industrialization changing the British landscape, while the takeover of authority figures by alien influences played on widespread fears of infiltration and subversion. Kneale was particularly concerned with the dangers of unquestioning conformity, a theme that resonated strongly in the 1950s with both fears of communism and concerns about American cultural influence. Perhaps the most multi-layered social commentary appears in Quatermass and the Pit, which tackled issues of race, hereditary violence, and urban development. The serial aired during a period of increased immigration to Britain from former colonies, and its exploration of racial memory and genetic inheritance can be read as a commentary on racial tensions of the time. Kneale subverts expectations, however, by revealing that the alien influence affects all humans regardless of background, suggesting that tribalism and violence are universal human traits rather than characteristics of any particular group. The London setting of Quatermass in the Pit is also significant, with its focus on the underground system and excavations uncovering the city's ancient layers. Post-war London was undergoing substantial redevelopment, with modern buildings rising from bomb sites and ancient streets being reconfigured. The serial captures the uncanny experience of living in a city where the past is constantly being unearthed by the march of progress. Professor Quatermass himself embodies a particular British attitude toward authority and expertise. Neither an establishment figure nor a rebellious outsider, he represents rational inquiry and moral responsibility in the face of both alien threats and human bureaucracy. His conflicts with military and political leaders throughout the series reflect Kneale's skepticism about institutional responses to crisis. What makes Kneale's social commentary particularly effective is that it never overwhelms the narrative or becomes didactic. The metaphors remain subtextual, enriching the viewing experience without distracting from the central horror elements. This approach allowed the Quatermass serials to function simultaneously as compelling entertainment and thoughtful critiques of contemporary society, a balance that many subsequent science fiction works have strived to achieve. Chapter 5: The Visual Language of Fear. Quatermass's Innovative Techniques. Despite severe technical limitations, the original Quatermass serials pioneered visual techniques that would become staples of television horror. Working with rudimentary equipment in an era of live broadcasting, director Rudolph Cartier and Nigel Kneale developed innovative approaches to creating tension and terror that influenced countless productions that followed. The original Quatermass experiment was particularly remarkable for its technical ambition. Broadcast live with only a few pre-filmed sequences, each episode required precise coordination between multiple studio spaces. Cartier employed overhead cameras and unusual angles to create a sense of disorientation appropriate to the story's themes of transformation and alienation. When Victor Carroon begins his metamorphosis, the camera work becomes increasingly unsteady and oblique, reflecting his distorted perceptions. For scenes beyond the capability of live studio production, such as Carroon's encounter with a cactus that he absorbs into his mutating form, Cartier used filmed inserts. These brief sequences allowed for special effects and locations impossible to recreate in the studio, adding production value while maintaining the immediacy of live performance. The technique of mixing live studio drama with filmed sequences would become standard practice in British television. Quatermass 2 built on these foundations, with more elaborate pre-filmed sequences including crowd scenes and the memorable finale at the alien processing plant. Cartier's background in German expressionist cinema influenced his use of shadow and silhouette, particularly in scenes where characters discovered they had been taken over by alien forces. The serial's depiction of the meteorites containing alien spores, simple but effective practical effects, demonstrated how suggestion could be more terrifying than explicit display. The visual high point of the original trilogy came with Quatermass in the Pit. By this time, television technology had advanced somewhat, allowing for more complex in-studio effects. The excavation of the Martian spacecraft, with its gradual revelation of the insectoid Martian corpses, is a masterclass in building tension through incremental disclosure. Rather than revealing the aliens all at once, Cartier and Kneale show them in fragments, a limb here, a head there, allowing viewers' imaginations to fill in the horrifying whole. The serial's climactic sequence, in which a giant manifestation of a horned Martian appears over London, pushed the boundaries of special effects television. Using a combination of models, optical effects, and suggestive editing, Cartier created an image of cosmic horror that transcended the production's budget constraints. The fact that this apparition was visible only to characters with particular psychic sensitivity provided both a narrative justification for its intermittent appearance and enhanced its otherworldly quality. Beyond specific effects, the Quatermass serials established a visual grammar for television horror that emphasized psychological tension over explicit shocks. Cartier's frequent use of close-ups captured the emotional reactions of characters confronted with incomprehensible phenomena, while carefully composed wide shots established the isolation of individuals against institutional backgrounds. Government facilities, scientific laboratories, urban landscapes, reinforcing themes of human vulnerability in the modern world. This approach influenced not only British television but horror filmmaking broadly. The documentary-like style of parts of the Quatermass serials, suggesting verisimilitude in the face of fantastic events, would later be employed to great effect in productions ranging from The Stone Tape, another Kneale work, to The Blair Witch Project, and beyond. By demonstrating that suggestion and psychological insight could create more lasting fear than explicit monster imagery, Quatermass helped elevate horror from pure shock value to a more sophisticated form of storytelling. Chapter 6. Literary and Scientific Roots. Kneale's Influences. Nigel Kneale didn't create Quatermass in a vacuum. His work shows a sophisticated understanding of both literary horror traditions and contemporary scientific developments, synthesizing these influences into something uniquely unsettling. The most obvious literary ancestor to Quatermass is H.G. Wells, particularly works like The War of the Worlds and The First Men in the Moon. Like Wells, Kneale used scientific speculation as a foundation for exploring human reactions to the unknown. The methodical investigation of alien phenomena in Quatermass echoes Wells's rational protagonists confronting extraordinary circumstances. However, where Wells often emphasized social satire, Kneale leaned more heavily into psychological horror. Elements of Lovecraftian cosmic horror also permeate the Quatermass serials, particularly Quatermass and the Pit, with its suggestion that human evolution and civilization have been influenced by ancient non-human intelligences. The concept that humanity's understanding of its own origins might be fundamentally flawed, and that true comprehension of our cosmic context might drive us to madness, is quintessentially Lovecraftian. Yet Kneale presents these ideas without Lovecraft's florid prose or explicit xenophobia, rooting them instead in archaeological and anthropological speculation. British ghost story traditions, particularly as developed by writers like M.R. James and Algernon Blackwood, inform Kneale's approach to building tension. The gradual accumulation of unsettling details, the sense that ordinary settings conceal extraordinary threats, and the preference for suggestion over explicit revelation all connect Quatermass to this literary lineage. Quatermass and the Pit, especially, with its uncovering of ancient horrors in modern London, has elements of the traditional British ghost story transposed into a science fiction framework. On the scientific front, Kneale was deeply engaged with developments in rocket technology, space exploration, and the biological sciences. The first serial aired when space travel was still theoretical rather than actual, predating Sputnik by 4 years, allowing Kneale considerable creative freedom while still grounding his narrative in plausible extrapolations of existing technology. The post-war period also saw significant advances in understanding of genetics and evolution, fields that Kneale incorporated particularly in Quatermass in the Pit. The serial's speculation about genetic memory and the evolutionary origins of human violence draws on contemporary scientific discussions while extending them in fictional directions. Similarly, the paranormal research depicted in the story references real work being done in parapsychology during the 1950s, when such investigation was taken more seriously by the scientific establishment than it would be later. Cold War concerns about nuclear power and radiation influenced all the Quatermass serials. The invisible, insidious nature of radiation contamination provides a scientific basis for the equally invisible alien infiltrations in the stories. The first serial aired just 8 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when public awareness of radiation's effects was growing but still incomplete, allowing Kneale to exploit anxieties about unseen biological transformations. Kneale's genius lay in combining these diverse influences into narratives that felt both intellectually substantial and viscerally frightening. By grounding fantastic elements in recognizable scientific and social contexts, he created horror that was harder to dismiss than purely supernatural tales. This approach would influence countless science fiction writers who followed, from Doctor Who scriptwriters to authors like Ramsey Campbell and filmmakers like John Carpenter. Chapter 7. The Quatermass Resurrection. Later adaptations and legacy. After the original trilogy, Quatermass lay dormant for nearly 2 decades before Nigel Kneale returned to the character for Quatermass, sometimes called Quatermass 4 or the Quatermass Conclusion, a 4-part serial produced by Euston Films for ITV in 1979. This production, starring John Mills as an elderly Quatermass coming out of retirement, presented a bleaker vision than the earlier serials, reflecting the more pessimistic cultural mood of the late 1970s. Set in a near-future Britain experiencing social collapse, the story involves young people being drawn to prehistoric stone circles by an alien force that harvests them. The serial's tone of despair and its imagery of youth cults reflected anxieties about punk subculture and social disintegration in late 1970s Britain. A condensed feature film version, Quatermass Conclusion, was released for international markets. In 2005, BBC4 produced a live remake of The Quatermass Experiment as part of a series of experimental broadcasts. Starring Jason Flemyng as Quatermass, this production attempted to recreate the immediacy of the original while updating certain elements for contemporary audiences. While it received mixed reviews, the production demonstrated the enduring interest in Kneale's creation. Beyond these direct continuations, Quatermass's influence permeates British science fiction and horror. The most obvious inheritor is Doctor Who, which debuted a decade after the first Quatermass serial. Early Doctor Who, particularly during the tenure of producer Verity Lambert, drew heavily on the template established by Quatermass: scientific investigation of otherworldly phenomena, Earth-based stories with contemporary settings, and the use of science fiction to explore social issues. Specific Doctor Who stories display clear Quatermass influence, including Spearhead from Space, 1970, with its meteorite-delivered alien consciousness, and The Demons, 1971, which echoes themes from Quatermass in the Pit, concerning ancient aliens influencing human development. John Pertwee's portrayal of the Third Doctor, with his scientific mindset and association with UNIT, a military organization investigating extraterrestrial threats, bears particular similarities to Professor Quatermass. In cinema, Quatermass's DNA can be found in numerous British horror and science fiction films. The work of directors like Val Guest, who helmed the first two Hammer Quatermass adaptations, and Roy Ward Baker shows continued influence from the visual style established in the serials. More broadly, the combination of scientific rationalism and cosmic horror that Kneale pioneered appears in films ranging from Village of the Damned, 1960, to The Stone Tape, 1972, written by Kneale himself, to more recent productions like The Descent, 2005, and Attack the Block, 2011. American filmmakers have also acknowledged Quatermass's influence. John Carpenter, in particular, has cited Kneale as a significant inspiration. His film, Prince of Darkness, 1987, bears thematic similarities to Kneale's work, dealing with scientific investigation of seemingly supernatural phenomena, while In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, explores Lovecraftian themes reminiscent of Quatermass and the Pit. Carpenter even invited Kneale to write the screenplay for Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, 1982, though Kneale ultimately requested his name be removed from the final product. The found footage horror subgenre, which exploded with The Blair Witch Project, 1999, owes a debt to the pseudo-documentary elements of Quatermass, particularly the emphasis on making fantastic events seem credible through realistic presentation. Similarly, the rise of conspiracy horror in the 1990s, exemplified by The X-Files, builds on the foundation laid by Quatermass 2 with its themes of government cover-ups and infiltration. In literature, Quatermass's influence extends beyond science fiction into weird fiction and horror. Authors like Ramsey Campbell, China Miéville, and Mark Z. Danielewski have acknowledged the impact of Kneale's work on their approach to combining intellectual concepts with visceral fear. The British tradition of folk horror, recently experiencing a revival through works like Robert Macfarlane's Underland, and films such as A Field in England, 2013, draws on the same connection between landscape, ancient history, and horror that Kneale explored in Quatermass and the Pit. Chapter 8. Quatermass in Cultural Context. Why it still matters more than 70 years after its initial broadcast. Why does Quatermass continue to resonate with audiences and creators? The answer lies partly in how the serials captured specific historical anxieties while addressing universal human fears that remain relevant today. The original trilogy aired during a period of profound transition in British society. The certainties of the pre-war world had been shattered. The empire was dissolving, and new technologies were transforming daily life. The Quatermass serials gave form to the nebulous anxieties these changes produced, presenting threats that were simultaneously alien and intimately connected to human nature and civilization. This ability to address contemporary concerns through metaphor allows Quatermass to transcend its era. The fear of invisible contamination, central to the Quatermass experiment, speaks to any period facing biological threats, from the HIV/AIDS crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic. Quatermass 2 explores corporate government collusion and environmental exploitation in ways that feel prescient in our age of climate crisis and surveillance capitalism. Quatermass and the Pit examines the biological roots of violence and tribalism, issues that continue to plague human societies worldwide. Beyond these specific themes, Quatermass pioneered a particular approach to horror that balances intellectual engagement with visceral fear. Professor Quatermass himself embodies this balance, a rational scientist confronted with phenomena that challenge not just his understanding of the world, but his conception of humanity's place in the cosmos. This combination of scientific inquiry and existential dread created what we might now call philosophical horror. a subgenre that continues to thrive in works ranging from Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy to films like Annihilation and Arrival. Quatermass also matters because it demonstrated television's potential as a medium for sophisticated storytelling. At a time when television was often dismissed as inferior to cinema and literature, Kneale and Cartier created works that used the medium's particular strengths: intimacy, serialization, the blending of realism and fantasy, to create experiences that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Their work helped establish television as a legitimate art form capable of addressing complex themes and employing innovative techniques. The character of Bernard Quatermass himself represents a particular kind of British hero who remains compelling, the rational individual standing against both incomprehensible cosmic forces and human institutional failures. Neither an action hero nor a flawless genius, Quatermass is fallible, sometimes arrogant, but ultimately driven by a commitment to understanding and protecting humanity. His approach to heroism emphasizes intellectual courage and moral responsibility over physical prowess or charismatic leadership, offering an alternative to more dominant hero archetypes. Perhaps most significantly, Quatermass matters because it reminds us that the most effective horror isn't about monsters or gore, but about challenging our fundamental assumptions about reality. Each Quatermass serial forces its characters, and by extension its audience, to reconsider what they thought they knew about human origins, civilization, or individual identity. This philosophical underpinning gives the stories a depth that purely sensationalist horror lacks. As we continue to face unprecedented global challenges, climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, the Quatermass approach to horror offers valuable insights. By using speculative scenarios to explore real anxieties, these stories help us process fears that might otherwise remain abstract and overwhelming. They remind us that confronting the unknown, however terrifying, is essential to human progress and survival. Conclusion: the broadcast that changed everything. Let us return to that summer evening in 1953, when British viewers first encountered Professor Bernard Quatermass. What many people don't know is that during the broadcast of the final episode, something extraordinary occurred that underscored the revolutionary nature of what Kneale and Cartier had created. As the climactic scene unfolded in Westminster Abbey, with the transformed Victor Caroon spreading across the ancient stonework, BBC switchboards were flooded with calls. Viewers were calling not just to comment on the program, but to ask whether the events they were witnessing were real. Despite the clearly fictional framing, something about the presentation, the documentary-like camera work, the scientific terminology, the familiar London settings, had momentarily blurred the line between fiction and reality for these viewers. This phenomenon wasn't as extreme as the famous panic that followed Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, but it revealed something profound about the power of television to create immersive experiences that feel immediate and real. In that moment, Kneale and Cartier discovered that television horror could affect audiences in ways fundamentally different from literature or cinema. What makes this particularly significant is that it presaged developments in horror that would emerge decades later. The found footage technique that powers films like The Blair Witch Project, the documentary aesthetics of shows like Ghostwatch, and the alternate reality games that expand fictional universes across multiple media all build on the insight that horror is most effective when it seems to breach the boundaries between fiction and everyday reality. Quatermass pioneered this approach not through deliberate hoaxing, but through meticulous attention to realistic detail combined with scientific plausibility. By grounding fantastic elements in recognizable settings and scientific concepts, Kneale created a form of horror that was harder to dismiss than purely supernatural tales. It lingered in the mind precisely because it couldn't be entirely confined to the realm of fiction. This legacy continues in contemporary works that blend horror with scientific speculation, from Alex Garland's Ex Machina to Denis Villeneuve's Arrival. Like Quatermass, these stories recognize that the most profound terrors emerge not from simple monsters, but from the implications of genuinely new knowledge that forces us to reconsider our place in the cosmos. So when you next find yourself watching a horror film that makes you question your understanding of reality, or a television series that uses scientific concepts to induce existential dread, remember Professor Bernard Quatermass. That stern, troubled rocket scientist from 1950s BBC television established a template for intelligent horror that continues to influence creators across all media. His legacy reminds us that the most enduring fear comes not from what we can see and identify, but from the moment when we realize that the universe is stranger, vaster, and more terrifying than we ever imagined, and that we ourselves might be part of its mystery.